Just a minute. Got it. Okay. All right, Dale. I think that we're ready. It's only 8:02, but we've got a real crowd here, and I'll keep monitoring the door. And I'm going to let you introduce our guest speaker. Welcome back to At Nourish, folks. It's really great to see all of you, and back at our monthly At Nourish. So Dale, to our best interviewer, it's yours.
Well, I would just like to say I'm honored that Mark Oppenheimer has agreed to come and talk to us about his really wonderful new book, Squirrel Hill, The Tree of Life Synagogue Shooting and the Soul of a Neighborhood. You all may be familiar with Mark if you listen to the podcast Unorthodox on Tablet Magazine. He's the host or one of the hosts. He's the author of 5 books, including Knocking on Heaven's Door, American Religion in the Age of Counterculture, and the Newish Jewish Encyclopedia, which is very readable. He was religion columnist for the New York Times from 2010 to 2016. He's written for the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Mother Jones, The Nation, The Believer. He teaches, he's head of the Yale Journalism Initiative, where he teaches undergraduates, maybe graduates too, I don't know, Mark, about how to write and communicate through journalism. And we have so much to learn about this, because when I wrote my email to my 50 best friends at Shomrei today, I was remembering that the Shabbat after the Squirrel Hill murders, a lot of us were at shul that Saturday, and Rabbi Greenstein opened basically the pulpit and asked everyone to just say what they were feeling, what brought them, what moved them to be there. And we had this incredible conversation about how it felt as Jews to have, learned about this. And then that was kind of the end of that group conversation. And Mark's book is from ground zero, the conversation and the lives and experiences of the people who felt this incredible attack come right to their door, and the traumatizing effects of it, and in a way, the regeneration that came to them, and that they helped each other arrive at, because they're all Jews and they're all part of a community. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark. He has a great presentation, and then he will take our questions.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you to all of you at your shul for having me. It's such a really nice honor. I was super excited that Dale asked me to. And as some of you may know, her son and daughter-in-law, Sam and Emma, and their 2 children are neighbors and dear friends of ours. So anything for the extended Rusakov-Purdy family. Yeah, what I want to do is I want to talk for a couple minutes, then I'm going to read just 2 pages of the book, because I really don't like long readings, and they bore me, and I seldom go to them myself. And then I want to show you some photographs from the book. The book is very illustrated, has about 60 photographs. And then I want to talk about the book by talking about these photographs in the book and the stories around them. And so I'll share my screen when I do that. And then I'm going to conclude by reading another page from the book. And that should all take less than half an hour. And then I really am excited to take your questions, because I always do learn so much from the questions, and I just like getting to know people, and it's my favorite part of everything. So we definitely want to leave at least half our time for that. October 27th, 2018, the morning of the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history, when 11 were killed inside Tree of Life, fully half the people who were inside. There were 22 people inside, and 11 didn't make it out alive. I was at Temple Emmanuel in Newton, Massachusetts that morning, 2 hours from my home in Connecticut. I had taken my eldest daughter, Rebecca, to the bat mitzvah of a summer camp friend of hers. So we were up in Boston, 100 miles from home. And somehow or other, even though no doubt there were people with phones out in this large conservative shul with hundreds of people there, it was a double bat mitzvah. There were two girls who had, they have so many members there, they have to double up many weekends. So surely someone had their phone out and knew what had happened, but somehow nobody told us. And we stayed for the whole service and the lunch afterwards, and just had a great time, and ate bagels and had no idea. And then I got out to my car and turned on my phone and saw all these messages saying, "Are you going to Pittsburgh? Did you hear about Pittsburgh? What about Pittsburgh?" And I, of course, immediately found this kind of funny, because I've had a smartphone since 2005 or so, and nobody had ever texted me about Pittsburgh. And I couldn't figure out why all these people were asking me about Pittsburgh. And then I navigated over to a news app and read what had happened. And I must have looked very stricken, because Rebecca, sitting next to me in the passenger seat, said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And I said, "There were Jews killed at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, in Squirrel Hill." And Rebecca said, "Dad, isn't that where we're from?" And I said, "Well, in a sense, yes," because what she knew correctly, although she's not from there, she's from Connecticut, and I'm from Western Massachusetts. But what Rebecca knew was that, in fact, her grandpa, my dad, is from Squirrel Hill, as was his father, And there have been, the Oppenheimers have been in Pittsburgh since we came to this country in the 1840s. And they were one of the families that settled Squirrel Hill when it became a neighborhood around the time of World War I. And so this immediately felt extremely close to home and extremely personal. And I immediately, as a writer, I start thinking those kind of dark thoughts about how sometimes something terrible happens, and the first thought is, do I have anything to write about it? Should I write about it? And I was, over the next few days, I was very intrigued by this story of this killing, not only because it felt very close, personally, because I have family there, and I still have family in Squirrel Hill, but also because I was aware that there was this rather thick irony that the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history had come to not only, as the journalist David Tribman pointed out, to possibly the least anti-Semitic city in the country, but also it had come to a neighborhood that had been the oldest, most stable Jewish neighborhood in the country, arguably, but I would make that argument. Squirrel Hill has been about a third Jewish since World War I. It has 100 years of having a substantial Jewish minority, which is way more than Newton, Massachusetts, or Skokie, Illinois, or anywhere in New Jersey, or Boca Raton. When you think of Jewish areas, most of them either were Jewish around the time of the Great Immigration in the 1890s, 1910s, 1920s, but had declined as a Jewish community. So my wife, for example, grew up on the Lower East Side of New York, which in 1920 had 500,000 Jews. There were more Jews on the Lower East Side than anywhere in the world. Today, there are still several tens of thousands, but it's like a tenth of what it once was. And then many other neighborhoods we think of as Jewish didn't really effloresce as Jewish neighborhoods until the 1930s or 40s or 50s. So, but Squirrel Hill has been the Jewish neighborhood of Pittsburgh since the teens, for a century exactly. So I got very, very curious about what it would mean for a neighborhood with this kind of depth of Jewish history, with these kind of social networks, with this kind of social capital, basically these support systems, to experience something terrible. And I wondered if maybe they would react with a kind of resilience that we would all be able to learn something from. That maybe a mass anti-Semitic attack in Squirrel Hill was an interesting thing to look at, more so than many of the other mass killings. And there have been over 300 mass killings since Columbine in 1999. The FBI, in fact, has a definition of mass killing, which is 4 or more deaths in one crime. And, a college senior today was born the year of Columbine and has practically never known a month without a mass killing. So I was very intrigued to see how Squirrel Hill handled it. What were the reverberations after the first wave of reporters had left, after the first day, after the first week, let's say. So I began going to Squirrel Hill that November, just a few weeks after it happened. I made my first trip, and I ended up going 32 times over the next 18 months before I stopped reporting and finally sat down and started writing, which happened coincidentally to be around when COVID hit. So I had to stop reporting and start writing anyway. And I interviewed about 250 people, including 9 of the 11 survivors and family members of 8 of the 11 victims. So I got pretty deep into the community. And the book that I wrote is, I hope, a kind of kaleidoscopic portrait of all the different ways that people respond. So it's not about the killer or the alleged killer, who does not particularly interest me. I was not interested in learning more about his racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic corner of the internet. Nor, frankly, is it a portrait of the 11 dead. I learned some stuff about them, but it's not about them, although each of them surely deserves a book of their own. It's really about the neighborhood as the protagonist. And I think you'll understand what I mean when I read you a little bit and share some photographs. So I want to first start by I'm going to read you just a page and a half. And it's about, it's the protagonist of this page and a half is a woman named Tammy Hepps, who is about 40 years old, grew up in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, but moved to Pittsburgh to do genealogical research on ancestors who had lived there. And she's become a real mocker in the community. She's very active in Jewish affairs and lives in Squirrel Hill, and everyone sort of knows her. And in the 24 hours after the killing, she was everywhere. She was praying psalms outside the synagogue where the bodies were still buried, unburied, still dead inside. She helped co-author a letter to President Trump demanding that he not come to Squirrel Hill unless he renounced white nationalism. She consoled a widow of one of the dead she bumped into at the JCC. She was sort of everywhere in Squirrel Hill. And finally, after a day or two, she's heading home. And on her way home, she's walking by Tree of Life, which she passes on her way to her house on Aylesboro Avenue. And she bumps into this guy with a truck. And you'll hear what happens. When she made a turn onto Murray Avenue, a truck pulled up in front of her. On the side of it were painted 3 curious words: crosses for losses. As Tammy Hepps remembered it, she looked into the truck and saw a pile of crosses in the back. They were all white, and on a quick count, she saw that there were 11 of them. As soon as she grasped what she was seeing, she was incensed. "I thought to myself," she said, "you have got to be fucking kidding me." And I looked around and no one else was there. And I thought, if I have to be the one to tell this man he can't put crosses on a synagogue, I will be the one to tell him he can't put crosses on a synagogue. Hepps had no idea who this guy was with this kind of nerve. As she was figuring out what to say to him, trying to keep her cool, she saw on the front seat of the truck a pile of wooden 6-pointed stars. She was relieved. I thought to myself, okay, what'll happen here is he'll put the stars of David on the crosses and it will be okay. Greg Zanis got out on the driver's side and approached Hepps. She looked him up and down. He was tired, unshaven, old. What was he doing here? Where had he come from? Then she looked down and saw his hands, and it was as if something had become clear. I saw his hands were covered in white paint, Hepps remembered. It's like he painted these things overnight and didn't even have time to wash his hands. He told me his intention. He said to me, I made these things, got in my truck, and drove 9 hours. There was white paint on his hands. He said to me, I've been driving the whole time. I don't even know the names of the people who died. I have to write their names on the stars. And then Hepps knew what she had to do. Her mother had emailed her the full list of the dead that morning, so she had the names on her phone. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, Irv Younger. I brought up this list on my phone and he said to me, can you please write the names in my notebook? When Hepps had written down all 11 names, she gave Zanis's notebook back to him. And now she had a question for him. I said to him, why do you do this? He said there had been gun violence in his family, and this was his response. He said, do you remember Parkland? I did that one. You remember Columbine? I did that one too. It had never occurred to me, Hepps said, that it was one person who had made it his life's work to drive around the country and do this. And at that moment, I realized we were just another one on the list. So she had bumped into Greg Zanis, whose obituary last winter was in the New York Times. He had been on CBS, on 60 Minutes, on 2020. He was the Crosses for Losses guy. And the fact that she bumped into him right there in front of Tree of Life was really bizarre and serendipitous. But she learned something very quickly about him, which was that he doesn't put crosses everywhere. When he knows the victims are Jewish, he puts stars of David on the cross to make it a Jewish symbol. When he knows the victims are Muslim, he puts a crescent moon. He has other symbols for Sikhs and Hindus. He even has some symbol that I forget, but it's for atheist and agnostic. So he had a book of something like 30 different symbols, and he would carve anything out of wood that he felt was appropriate. So in some ways, he's like the echt example, the ultimate example of the kind of thing that visits a neighborhood after mass killing that is kind of off the grid. You don't expect it. It's not just death. It's not just murder. It's this sort of other thing, this sort of bizarro world that visits these neighborhoods after there are mass killings. I want to show you a little bit more of what I mean, again, with photographs from the book. So you can now see the cover of my book. And I show people this because it's kind of interesting to read it as a text. This is the scene from outside Tree of Life a day or two after the killing, and you can see it's at night, and you can see these little tea candles, which are, you know, Jewish yahrzeit candles, Jewish candles for the dead, which is a very Jewish way of expressing grief or mourning. And they're commingling with bouquets of flowers, which of course is a Christian or a kind of broadly American idiom. So right there, you can see that even in the first 48 hours, the memorial garden that springs up organically outside the synagogue is unwittingly almost an interfaith garden where everyone brings the things that they don't think of as religious, that just feel comfortable to them, but that kind of instantly make it this sort of multi-religious, multi-faith site. There's Greg Zanis. This is not him in Pittsburgh. These are different names on his crosses, but it gives a sense of what these crosses are and what he does, the work that he did. He put something like 4 million miles on 7 different pickup trucks over 25 years. He started doing this in the mid-90s, and he kept doing it until cancer slowed him down and ultimately took his life last year. It's worth pointing out that he himself is a Christian, an evangelical Christian, and he was a retired carpenter. So Christian carpenters are always kind of springing up, always showing up where the Jews are, it seems. This image, which many of you have seen, was kind of the ubiquitous symbol of the tragedy. It was everywhere in the days and weeks and to this day after the tragedy. I wanted to find out who created it. And so I hunted down this guy. His name is Tim Hines, not spelled like the ketchup or the football field. That's a big Pittsburgh family, the Hineses. His name is spelled Hindes. Hindus is how I mispronounced it for a while. And he's a German-American, lapsed Lutheran graphic designer who lives in the south suburbs of Pittsburgh across the Monongahela. And he was home that afternoon, and he had been listening on the radio to what had happened, and he wanted to do something for the Jews. So he started fiddling around on his Macintosh, and he wanted to make an image that expressed Pittsburgh's solidarity with Jews. So he thought, what's more Pittsburgh than the Pittsburgh Steelers symbol, and what's more Jewish than the Star of David? So we ended up replacing the yellow, it's not a star, those are actually called hypocycloids, the blue and red things in the Steelers logo. The geometers among us will know this. I had to learn it on the fly. But he ended up replacing the yellow hypocycloid with a yellow Star of David, and then he replaced the word Steelers with stronger than hate. He posted it on Facebook. It went around the world 10 trillion times over the next few hours. And by the next day, people were holding up posters with this image at Steelers games. People had put it on yarmulkes, t-shirts, babies' onesies, tote bags, you name it. And he never took a penny for it. He ended up giving the rights over to the Steelers on the condition that they never take a penny for it either. So it's now more or less in the public domain. But again, it was like the act of a German-American ally with no connection to Tree of Life at all. This is something many of you will have seen. This is the headline in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette the Friday after the killing. It's the first line of the mourner's Kaddish, Yit Gadal, Yit Gadash, Shemei Rabbah. The editor of the Post-Gazette, David Shribman, who is a Jewish man married to a Catholic woman whose daughter, Natalie Shribman, was just ordained a Reform rabbi last May. He had this idea for a headline, and he called his rabbi at Temple Sinai, which was not one of the congregations that was attacked, and said, Rabbi Gibson, would you send me the first line of the Kaddish? And Gibson did, and it ended up being an interesting new media story because they didn't have a Hebrew typeface at the Post-Gazette. So they had to somehow jigger this, like they took a photograph of it and imported it as a PDF or something, but they couldn't actually type this out in Hebrew. And some of you, if there are any scholars there, will notice that the last letter of it is wrong. It's an unvoiced hey, and it should be an unvoiced aleph, but never mind. That's not important. It's the thought that counts. And this, you can see it's a photograph of the Thursday funerals. This ran on Friday, which was the 4th consecutive day of funerals in Pittsburgh. So imagine, within a 3 square mile area, 11 people are murdered, and they're buried over Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So it was simply an unbelievably difficult time in those in those few blocks. And this headline, as it arrived on people's doorsteps or as they took it out of their newspaper kiosks or bought it at the newsstand, was extraordinarily moving. And people just saw the headline and broke down and cried. It's right up there with Dewey defeats Truman as one of the great American headlines. I was really interested in the public art that comes to neighborhoods after a mass killing. What's more American than a Starbucks? This is the Starbucks at the corner of Forbes and Shady. It's one of the 2 Starbucks in Squirrel Hill, the more centrally located one. And in the days after the killing, the Presbyterian manager of the Starbucks, Melissa Lysott, wanted to do something for her beloved Jewish customers. A lot of Jews use this Starbucks, and they know exactly what's kosher in the Starbucks and what's not, which is a whole subfield of Talmudic disputation that I can get into because I've written about the people who study Starbucks kashrut. So if you have questions, you can hit me in the chat afterwards. But she brought in her friend. She had a friend who was an artist, Nicole Flannery, a Roman Catholic, and said, Nicole, do something for the Jews in the windows. And so Nicole consulted an Orthodox Jewish fellow she knew, and they came up with this Star of David, this Tree of Life, and this dove, and the words ahava, chesed, and tikva, love, kindness, and hope. And they're still there. I was in Pittsburgh 2 weeks ago, and it's still there, and I think it'll be there forever. And I just love the idea that 30 years from now, teenagers will be quaffing frappuccinos inside the Starbucks and wonder why there's Hebrew lettering in the windows, and they'll ask and someone will tell them. This is my photograph, which is why the composition is so poor. If you look at, this is the Squirrel Hill sign at the base of Forward Avenue, getting off the freeway. And if you look at the H in Hill, you'll see there's a little blue Star of David hanging from it. That was one of thousands of handcrafted Stars of David, either made out of glitter paper or popsicle sticks, or sometimes sewn or knitted, that or paper mache that arrived in Squirrel Hill. There was a Facebook group that organized a huge dump of them. They collected thousands from around the world and then hung them from signage and from lampposts and trees all over the city. And this was, then the winter came and most of them were destroyed by the elements, but this one was still there in March. And so I took a photograph of it. I think it was one of the last surviving ones in all of Squirrel Hill. But again, I was very interested in the ways that the whole world kind of comes to town after something like this. And these Stars of David were made all over the world, literally. And some of them had signatures of little children, and they would say, grade 5, Chestnut Hill Elementary School, Peoria, Illinois, or something. And you could just see, or Nottingham, England. It was kind of amazing. I like this photograph. I don't know whose hearse this is, but the fact that there are Orthodox people acting as shomrim, as guards, walking behind the hearse, even though none of the dead was Orthodox, it testifies to the extraordinary level of intra-faith solidarity in Pittsburgh, which was really interesting. Pittsburgh is a neighborhood where the Orthodox and conservative and reform and Reconstructionist and secular and unaffiliated all know each other and are in each other's lives in a way that is very, very rare in American or world Jewry. One of the other things that happens after an attack is money comes to town. People want to give money, and something like $7 million was raised. Most of it through the synagogue's websites, but also through the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. But a lot of it was raised by this one guy, Sheikh Hatiri, who is an Iranian immigrant, and a proudly lapsed Muslim who aspires to be an American citizen. And he woke up the morning of the killing, heard what had happened, and went to a local coffee shop in Washington, D.C., where he's a grad student at Johns Hopkins, and went on GoFundMe.org and opened up a GoFundMe page to benefit the Tree of Life families and victims. And within a week, it had raised over $1 million. It became this viral sensation, and it was retweeted by Jake Tapper from CNN, and it became this huge thing. And he's aside from sort of legacy Jewish organizations, if you look at kind of outsiders, he's the largest single fundraiser for the Pittsburgh Jewish community ever. And again, this sort of Muslim aspiring American who, when I asked him to send me a picture, of course, sent me a picture of himself holding Plato's Republic and standing in front of the White House, just to tell us exactly how deeply into Western civilization he is. I mean, nobody wants to be more American than Sheikh Hatiri. A bunch of teenagers organized a Havdalah, as you guys know, a ritual to mark the end of the Sabbath that evening, right? So the first public event to commemorate the victims was organized by a dozen teenagers from Alderdice High School, who sat at that Starbucks and planned it and got a stage and got microphone equipment and got candles and made it all happen. It was an interfaith group. This is Emily Pressman on the left, and her friend Isabel Smith, not Jewish, African-American and ancestrally Christian. It's an interesting fact that Isabel is the niece of Tracy Smith, the former poet laureate, a fun fact, and a Pittsburgher. These women are both now in college, but at the time they were high school seniors, and they were among the people who made this happen. And they brought several thousand people to the intersection of Forbes and Murray Avenues. This is an important photograph for what it doesn't show. Elsewhere at the intersection, out of the camera sight lines, you would be able to see Sixth Presbyterian Church across from so you'd see the JCC, and across from the JCC, you'd see Sixth Presbyterian, which was the home church for 40 years of Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers, of course, lived in Squirrel Hill. And when he went to create the sort of ultimate, fantasy happy neighborhood for the world's children, he based it on Squirrel Hill. So this really is Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. People come to town, including politicians. There was a lot of controversy about whether the president should come. Some people wanted him to, some people didn't want him to. Some people said, come, but wait until after all the funerals. He didn't. He came on the Tuesday, and so his motorcade kind of crashed through the neighborhood as people were trying to get to funerals and shivas and so forth. This is Rabbi Jeffrey Meyers on the right, who did meet with the president, which was a tough decision for him. And but ultimately he felt, rabbis extend hospitality to anyone. You can see in front of them the Jewish Stars of David.
Mark? Yeah, I think we lost his connection because the video was freezing.
Whoops.
I'm back.
There you
Can
are.
you hear me? There I am. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's keep going. So where were? Did you see me? I was talking about Trump.
Here you
Trump.
are. That's what.
You got it all?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're back with the president, the
Yeah.
former president. And I was just saying that a lot of people felt that Rabbi Meyers shouldn't meet with the president and first lady, but he ultimately decided that, a rabbi's job is to extend hospitality. And so he did. The controversy being a lot of people felt that the president had never fully renounced white nationalism, and the alleged killer had in fact posted anti-immigrant and white nationalist sentiments online. So it felt like of all the events to come to sort of Pittsburgh was tacky. But as other people, I think, correctly pointed out, if the president hadn't come, that would have been perceived as tacky as well, because presidents go to these things. As a form of protest, a lot of thousands of people turned out to protest the presidential visit. And one of the things they did was enact a form of Korea. Korea is the ritual, where Jews tear their garments when they hear that someone has died, or they sometimes will affix a black ribbon and tear the ribbon on their garments. And what they did as a sign of grief at the president's visit, grief about the president's visit, was they handed out black pieces of paper and they all went quiet. And when someone gave the signal, they held the paper up and tore them. So what you see is these people holding up pieces of black paper and tearing them. Not everyone was so subtle. This was also there. And I put this there just to show the whole range of response to Trump's visit, but signs like this were pretty rare. Most of the protest was peaceful, not just physically, but also kind of spiritually. And there was one arrest. This is University of Pittsburgh sociology professor Joshua Bloom, who sat down in front of the motorcade and meditated, and had to be forcibly moved by the police, who he says treated him very nicely, and he was released the next day and no charges were filed. Again, people come, not just politicians, not just donors with their money, not just artists with their public art, but Tom Hanks, who came to town. So did Jeremy Piven. So lots of celebrities came through town to pay their respects. Here he is hugging Joanne Rogers. So in a sense, this is like the first couple. I mean, Tom Hanks and Mrs. Rogers is like every bit as much the first couple as the Bidens or the Trumps or the Clintons, or, Tom Hanks and Mrs. Rogers. That's like, how American is that? Some of you in the, if you're of the football fan persuasion, will recognize that luscious head of white hair. That's Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots, and somebody who grew up in a fairly observant household himself. And he came to town when the Patriots came to town to play the Steelers. And the day before the game, he was in town and stopped by the space that Tree of Life is now using for a boy's bar mitzvah. He gave the boy some tickets to the next day's game. And And of course, he's wearing the Steelers stronger than hate Jewish star yarmulke. So I felt I had to take out my phone, even though it was Shabbos, and take a picture of this because God wanted me to record the owner of the Patriots wearing Steelers garb. I mean, never before in history has the Patriots owner put on the garb of another team. I also thought it was really funny that he came and he took the 7th Aliyah, because I thought, like, this was a bar mitzvah. I wonder who got bumped for Robert Kraft. You know, I wonder if like Aunt Sylvia was going to get that Aliyah, and then Robert Kraft shows up. Like, sorry, Patriots owner in the audience, he gets the Aliyah. So maybe no one had it. Maybe it was an empty Aliyah anyway, just waiting for a billionaire to walk in. One of the other things that happens after a killing is people bring their animals. There are therapy dogs everywhere. Some of these dogs came from as far away as New Jersey. I mean, not by themselves, but their owners brought them. And you can see these dogs are both wearing the red jackets that indicate that they have special trauma training. This girl is holding a sign. It's a card she made for the police, and says, "Thank you for keeping the Jews in my neighborhood safe. Love, Lily, age 6," which I found very moving. And then I just want to conclude here by talking about this guy holding the beautifully made handmade challah. He's a New Jerseyan. Robert Zacharias. He went to some large Reform temple, the name of which I forget, but I've had people in my audience who know his family. And I conclude with this because in some ways his story is like so typical to me of the kind of weirdness that I wanted to capture. And I want to read you, to conclude, I want to read you a page about Robert Zacharias. So we can just take a good look at his Irenic, beautiful punim, and then you can look at me again. Okay, we back on me. So let's pin me if we can. Am I pinned? So I want to read you this bit about Robert Zacharias, or Zach as he's known. The morning of the shooting, Zach had been hanging with a friend at her apartment in Bloomfield, northwest of Squirrel Hill. After getting the news of the shooting, he went home. He checked in with his family and friends. And a couple hours later, in mid-afternoon, he went to the Giant Eagle supermarket to buy soup and yahrzeit candles, small candles one lights to honor the dead. Before he left for the Havdalah, he dug into his closet for one of his yarmulkes. He put it on and left for the market. That was the first time he'd ever worn a yarmulke when it wasn't Shabbat, a Jewish holiday, or some special occasion. Zach kept the yarmulke on his head at the Havdalah planned by the Alderdice students. He has been wearing one ever since. It's a new experience for me to be wearing a yarmulke out in the world on a regular basis, Zach said. It has these interesting implications. He mentioned a night when he and his girlfriend were trying to decide where to go out to eat. As he remembered it, I was like, well, Gooski's is open. We could go to Gooski's. But then I was like, well, I've heard they have Nazis at Gooski's. Zach was referring to the rumor that at some point in the past, some sort of neo-Nazi punk band had played a gig at Gooski's, a small dive bar in the Polish Hill neighborhood. Zach figured the rumor was probably false, but his head was spinning with possibility. He'd thought about the overlap between punks, many of whom lived in Polish Hill, and various strains of white nationalist ideology. And then he thought that if there were neo-Nazis hanging out at Gooski's, he now looked like a target. But I didn't want to take my yarmulke off, he said. That didn't feel right. That would be some sort of bizarre paying of obeisance to the ghost or not ghost Nazis, and I didn't want to do that. But I also didn't want to not go to Gooski's if I wanted to go to some neighborhood bar that has vegan kielbasa. The yarmulke complicated everything. If he took it off, the neo-Nazis, real or imagined, would win. If he kept it on but skipped Gooski's, then the neo-Nazis, real or imagined, would still win by depriving him of tasty vegan kielbasa. But if he said yes to the yarmulke and to Gooski's, he put his newly visibly Jewish self in sight of the real or imaginary neo-Nazis. Just to be clear, I investigated this, and there seems to be no substantiation of the rumor that there were ever Nazis at Gooski's. Zach weighed his options, screwed up his courage, and took himself and his girlfriend to Gooski's. When he stepped inside, he took a look around, and his first thought was, these aren't anti-Semites. He saw a coworker at the bar, reading the New York Times app on her iPhone as she drank a beer and smoked a cigarette. This was copacetic. But the yarmulke was not finished with him yet. He and his girlfriend sat at the bar and placed their orders. I made a very expensive order by mistake, he recalled. And I was like, oh, I shouldn't get all that food. He turned away from the bar to look at his menu to figure out what to order instead. And as he turned away, he noticed the bartender looking at his yarmulke. And then he was immediately concerned that she would see him changing his order as a manifestation of his Jewishness. I was like, oh, God damn it. Now I'm a money grubbing Jew. Like, I'm complaining about this expensive order and adjusting my order to be less expensive. So I felt bad about that because now I'm a symbol of all the Jews. I'm a standard bearer for these people for whom I don't bear a standard. Zach was still feeling like the guy in the yarmulke who had flagged a problem with his restaurant tab when something compounded his misery. He lifted his bottle of Yingling to his mouth to have a sip, and a bit of it sloshed out and landed on a man sitting next to him at the bar. It was just a tiny bit of beer, and it seemed that the man didn't notice. So Zach elected not to say anything. I thought, oh, he doesn't notice, doesn't matter. But no sooner had Zach elected to let the matter drop than the man turned around. He had noticed. Zach quickly apologized, hoping to make everything right, but it was too late. I was like, I'm sorry, I spilled some beer, but I hadn't said it when I'd spilled the beer. So yet again, I think now I'm a jerk, a selfish, unapologetic Jew person. So it's even worse. Everything's bad. Zach threw his hands up in despair. A public Jew, it seems, can never win. So I conclude with that because I just think it's so delightful that when we think of mass killings, we tend to think of, quite rightly, of the loss of life and the death. But we don't think of the strange and subtle, invisible ways that lives change. We don't think of the people who, who rediscover their crafting to make public art. We don't think of the people who paint a sign in the Starbucks. We don't think of the people I met who decided to convert to Judaism because they'd always kind of thought about it, and now they felt like they wanted to be all in as a statement of solidarity with the people that they realized they felt were their tribe. We don't think about the challah bakers who delivered anonymous challahs in the night in Squirrel Hill and never took credit for it. We don't think about the Iranian immigrant who raises money on GoFundMe. There's all of these various manifestations. We don't think about the guy who puts on a yarmulke and just keeps wearing it. And there's all of these manifestations of different responses, most of them off the grid, off the radar. And what I liked about them was I really felt that that as much as the kind of big responses, the public vigils, the money that's raised, the kind of big memorials that draw thousands of people, it's kind of these little things around the margins that you get a lot of in a neighborhood like Squirrel Hill, and that ultimately I think are what enable the neighborhood, insofar as it can, not just to survive, but in some small way to thrive. And that's what the book's about. So thank you very much. Can't hear you, Dale.
Sorry.
There we
Thank you
go.
so much, Mark. That was absolutely fabulous. And it just,
Thank you.
it was a beautiful summary of the book, but having read it, I know how much you had to pick from and how much you didn't get to tell us. And, I don't know, have people been putting questions somewhere?
Oh, yeah. So,
I haven't.
not yet.
No.
They should.
Okay. So should they put them in the chat, or should they raise their hands, or
Why
what?
don't we let them put them in the chat, Dale, because
Okay.
there are too many people and we're going to miss hands.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
let's encourage
But
that.
I wanted to ask something, I was just reading the book, so struck by how open people were with you. And also you mentioned that some people were very hesitant and some people didn't talk at all. And I just wondered, how did you find that most of these people wanted to talk and were kind of waiting to talk, that they knew they were living history, and they wanted to talk about it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of levels to that answer. And yeah, I'm super excited to take questions. People to type away in the chat, and I'll take those when I'm done with this one. But this is a great question. So over 90% of the people I asked to talked. And that was a reminder of something that, as a journalist, which is most people actually like telling their stories. And most people, I mean, I've had a lot of people say to me, I've never been interviewed before. And it is this kind of fundamental conferral of dignity, I think, that, there's a reason we feel good when doctors take time with us and ask for our narrative, right? And there were definitely a lot of people who were happy to be asked and were excited to talk. Some people had a kind of world historical sense that they owed it to the world to talk, but mostly that wasn't the case. Mostly it was like I think they just wanted to talk. There was one person who was inside the building who was, made it out alive, who talked, I think, out of a sense that history he owed it to history. But generally, I think people just said yes because people say yes. There were some people who said, I will talk to you, but not yet. And one person said, call me in 6 months. This was a local rabbi who had not part of this congregation, but felt, what he said to me was, I feel like I have to double down on my pastoral work and tend to my people for 6 months. And I have no energy for anything else. But if you call me in 6 months, I will talk to you. And I called him in 6 months, and he did. And he's all over the book. And he was a wonderful source after that, but he needed 6 months. And then there were, but again, 9 of the 11 survivors talked to me. One of the ones who didn't was the Italian-American Gentile custodian, who only gave one interview to local TV the day after the killing and then never spoke to the media again. And I understand, he just wanted to get on with his life. And there was one other survivor who did not talk to me. But almost everyone did. And I think it was largely just, I didn't have any tricks. Some people said, how did you get them to talk? I think it was, and also here's the other thing. Pittsburghers, although they will deny it, are fundamentally Midwesterners, which means they're nice. And they just can't imagine being so rude as to decline. And they get very hot under the collar if you call them Midwestern, but it's a compliment in the sense, and they should just learn to live with it.
So Dale, I'll pick up on there are 2 questions, Mark, and
Yeah.
I do a lot of work in Pittsburgh, and they are very nice.
They're super nice.
Yeah. 2 questions about how the community is doing now.
Yeah.
What do you know about the synagogue? What's going on in Squirrel Hill? You have connections.
Right. I mean, I always want to be perfectly candid and say, of course, I've been back only once since COVID started. I mean, I finished the reporting and I stopped. At some point, you have to stop. You have to stop reporting and start writing. And so that was in March of 2020. I did go back a couple weeks ago for an author event, and I'm going back tomorrow for another thing. But I can't speak to the last year and a half. What I can say is that it is a wonderful thing that most people snap back to normal. I mean, grief recedes and trauma recedes for most people to some extent. And every person's different, and there are people who are still living it every day. And there are people who within a week or two said, I'm fine, and to all appearances seem to be. And then there's everything in between. But, most places feel pretty normal after a little while, which is both great because it's adaptive and it's what we have to do as human beings. It's also sad because people do forget. And I think especially outside the Jewish community, I mean, certainly if you go to other neighborhoods of Pittsburgh now and say, oh, I'm here to do a story on the killing, they don't know what you mean. I mean, it's, there've been a lot of, most people, I mean, I don't remember, I couldn't name more than 10 sites of mass killing out of the 350 since Columbine. Once I got past Parkland and, Columbine and Charleston, I mean, I could get up to 8 or 9, but I don't know 20. So people do forget, and that's definitely gone on as well. In terms of the congregation, there were 3 congregations in that building: the landlord congregation and 2 tenants, all of whom lost members. They lost 7, 3, and 1 member respectively. And the landlord congregation, Tree of Life, has this huge task of figuring out what to do with the building, and they still haven't fully figured out what to do with the building, and that's been kind of become an albatross around their neck. And if they want to completely renovate it, they need to raise an enormous amount of money. And if they and they can't decide, do they tear it down? Do they renovate it? Do they keep it exactly as it was? Like, there are different points of view of how you honor the victims. Some would say you keep it exactly as it was to honor the victims, and some would say you raise it to the ground to honor the victims. And both of them have a kind of logic to them. So that's still up in the air.
Dale, do you see the next ones, or shall I just keep going here? She's muted. There's a new documentary, A Tree of Life. Have you seen that? And do you know anything about it?
No and no. Sorry about that.
All right.
Here's another one from Dan Brillman. Just a comment. Tree of Life was my temple growing up. This event hit home. Squirrel Hill is a remarkably proud neighborhood, and Pittsburghers are a proud people, not Midwestern. Anyway, thanks for this, and really looking forward to your book, he says.
I mean, well, thank you. I mean, I have discovered that one of my superpowers, I have a new superpower, which is wherever I go, I bring out the Pittsburghers. And it's true virtually, it's true in person. I mean, I've spoken to, I had an audience of 30 people, 5 at one place in Massachusetts, 5 of whom were from Squirrel Hill, and they didn't know each other. They knew each other from town, but they didn't know they'd all grown up in Squirrel Hill. It's wonderful. I mean, I'm always eavesdropping as an event wraps up on people who, knew each other in Pittsburgh or playing Jewish geography with each other. because they both turned out for this. So I like being a draw for Pittsburghers. I'll say that.
I see a question here from Sam Purdy. Among the wonderfully thoughtful aspects you explored was the randomness of the community's rabbis being thrust into these incredibly public roles. Some spoke to you more than others. What was your reflection on the impact of the massacre on these men?
Yeah, so there were 3 congregations. 2 of them had rabbis. One is more or less lay-led, but had kind of lay leadership. And it's bizarre, right? I mean, there was a period of time, and one could argue it's still true, when the most famous rabbi in America was Jeffrey Meyers, who, hadn't even been a rabbi until a few years earlier. He was a cantor who got a kind of, did a distance learning seminary and got a late in life ordination to become a rabbi, and was kind of at the end of a career and at a pretty small membership synagogue at that. And, not someone who had done a lot of good in his life, but not someone who had a high profile rabbinic career. And all of a sudden he's the most interviewed rabbi in America for a time. And the same could be said of Jonathan Perlman at New Light congregation. So there was a kind of randomness to it, and they took to it in different ways. Meyers, it turned out, had a pretty strong facility with, he's not an easy man to get to know. I find him distant, but he's very good in front of the cameras. He has a very good public presence. And Perlman, whom I found much more chatty with me personally, is a more shy, diffident person in public. And also, I think, and by the way, they're both survivors. They're both among the 11 who got out alive. And he had some depression. Perlman did in the year afterwards, and I think has had a remarkably amazing journey. And his congregation really rallied around him. But it's tough. I mean, I think being the rabbi, and these are people who saw their congregants executed. I mean, think of what that is to carry. Saw, or in one case saw, in one case heard their congregants being executed. So I can't imagine what it's like to be them.
Mark, I was really interested in a point you made near the end about how, for the most part, except for the one lay-led, much more progressive activist congregation, there really wasn't a coming together of Jews around after this massacre around the issue of gun control, and that the one congregation that did was very much kind of the odd person or the odd congregation out. And you had some thoughts about why that was, and I wanted you to talk about that.
I mean, I actually don't remember exactly how I might have suggested why that was. Pittsburgh is a place that's very good at holding together opposing political. I mean, this is Pennsylvania, right? This is the purplest state in the country, and Western Pennsylvania is by and large quite conservative. And Pittsburgh, certain neighborhoods in Pittsburgh are more liberal, but certain ones aren't. And they're all very, I mean, I just drove from Pittsburgh back to Connecticut last time I was there a few weeks ago. I drove it. And if you go 5 miles north of the city and then take, I think it's Route 20, which runs parallel to the turnpike. If you take that, I mean, it is rural gun country. And Pittsburgh feels that much. So Pennsylvania, of course, famously has a lot of rural and conservative areas. You don't feel it when you're in Philadelphia as much. Philadelphia is buffeted by way more suburbs that feel like extensions of Philadelphia. When you're in Pittsburgh, like, you really don't have to go far either in the city or outside the city to feel like you're in non-urban America and non-elite America, non-blue America, all those things. And the other thing is Squirrel Hill has a lot of Orthodox, many of whom are more Republican than the Reform and Reconstructionist and to some extent conservative Jews there. So it is a community very practiced at holding together, at staying and not talking about politics, at sort of holding together, at least, bracketing it a lot of the time so that they can work together on stuff, which, by the way, is something I find incredibly admirable. Like, I get the impulse, and it's temperamentally, I like that impulse. But I also understand, I mean, I ended the book with Tammy Hepps, the woman who encountered the Crosses for Losses guy at the beginning of the book. I end the book with her saying that she feels like it was a failure, like she and others had been called to this moment to really do something the way that she felt the Parkland students had done something, and she feels that they failed. and she carries that sense of failure with her. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It really is. There's another question here. Linda Ariel wants to know more about the interactions between the Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist and JCC communities in the aftermath. I mean, just what was that like? She was pointing out that it's
so. I mean, the thing to remember is that Pittsburgh is a place where all of the Jewish groups, to the extent they have a geographic center, it's the same geographic center, right? Now that's not true in New York City, right? Where, I would say the modern Orthodox center is the Upper West Side. I would say the Reform center is Park Slope and Brownstone, Brooklyn. And the Haredi ultra-Orthodox center is Borough Park and Williamsburg, right? These are all different centers. And by the way, the Reconstructionist center is the Upper West Side, but also Westchester County has a couple of Reconstructionist Chavarot. So, but in Pittsburgh, it's all the same center. The JCC has all of these people. They're definitely Orthodox people who work out there and use it for stuff. There's a large Chabad community. The Orthodox day school is very close to the pluralist / I guess you'd say maybe conservative day school. And they all use the same shopping district. So, these are communities that are well practiced in doing stuff together, social stuff, holidays. The night of learning for Shavuot, the Tikkun Leil Shavuot at the JCC has people from all of these denominations there teaching and learning. So it made perfect sense that in the aftermath, like the Orthodox Chevra Kadisha, the Orthodox Burial Society, would do some of the burials, some of the Taharas. And then the Liberal Burial Society. First of all, the fact that Pittsburgh has 2 burial societies is insane. Like, that is so rare, and it was so interesting, and it deserves a book all on itself. There's so much. Burial societies aren't supposed to talk about the work they do. They're supposed to be anonymous. And the fact there are 2 of them that each have several dozen people means there's like 75 to 100 people involved in sort of deathcraft in greater Pittsburgh, ranging from kind of Reconstructionists, and converts and whatever, all the way to traditional Orthodox people. And they cooperated in the aftermath of this because you have to give all the bodies proper burials with special, you say prayers and you wash them with water and you sew them into linen shrouds. But then also they had to clean up. You're supposed to bury all the organic matter. So they had to go inside the synagogue and scrape all the blood and bone spurs and everything and give it proper burials. And they did this together. It's like, it is so phenomenal what happened that week and the level of cooperation and the level of like sanctification that went on that week. I feel like my book doesn't even come close to doing it justice. Like, it's a place where I just feel like I like what I wrote about it, but it ultimately feels kind of failed for not giving as good an answer to your question as I wish I could.
Well, that was pretty good. Now we have a question here from Lily Lucy. She teaches music in our religious school, and she's also a rabbinic intern. A Rebecca Solnit quote from her Rosh Hashanah Day 1 sermon from the book A Paradise Built in Hell: The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disasters. Here's the quote: "Disasters are most basically terrible, tragic, grievous, and no matter what positive side effects and possibilities they produce, they are not to be desired. But by the same measure, those side effects should not be ignored because they arise amid devastation. The desires and possibilities awakened are so powerful they shine even from wreckage, carnage, and ashes. What happens here is relevant elsewhere. And the point is not to welcome disasters. They do not create these gifts, but they are one avenue through which the gifts arrive. Disasters provide an extraordinary window into social desire and possibility, and what manifests there matters elsewhere in ordinary times and in other extraordinary times." Yeah. Are you familiar with that quote?
I'm not familiar with that quote. I'm familiar with Rebecca Solnit's work. And I know that her work on disasters, that one of the things she's written is that sort of contrary to the sort of horror-scape mythology of like the aftermath of Katrina, where we had these urban legends of people hurting each other and crimes and people running amok, that it's usually the opposite. I mean, one of the points she makes is that actually people are usually at their best in the aftermath of disasters and their kindest. And now that can not always, right? There was all the looting in the aftermath of the New York City blackout in the 70s, right? Like sometimes where the social fabric is frayed enough, it's not the case. But I think basically I think basically that's true. I mean, I think that what you saw here, I think there does have to be a kind of fundamental, people have to feel they're in community, and they have to feel a kind of fundamental baseline of trust. Otherwise, they may turn on each other when the police are distracted and kind of there's enemy and chaos. But by and large, they don't, and they didn't. A lot of good stuff happens, and no, you wouldn't wish for the disaster. I mean, the most important effect is that there are 11 people missing. But there are things worth noticing that happen, some of which we can learn from.
Yeah, I felt reading your book that there was holiness there, that there was a feeling that that it brought out a certain holiness in people. And I just found that incredibly moving.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, one of the things I try to remember is that there were a lot of people who did stuff. Look, anyone who gives in the aftermath of something like this should be commended for giving. There was, however, a profound difference between the people who gave the stuff they felt like giving and the people who asked, what does the community need? And a lot of the people who asked, what does the community need, then gave it, whether it was money or time or showing up to read Torah because the Torah readers had been murdered, gave it quietly and anonymously. And many of them don't end up in my book because I never met them. And I think that's also just really, really important to remember. I mean, what Tree of Life needed more than anything in the aftermath of the killing was 7 new members to help them make the minyan and to read Torah and Haftorah. And they didn't get that. So
I'm going to take the mic here and say thank you. And actually, Mark, what you just said is a wonderful transition. In December, our next at Nourish speaker, is the director of our Family Life Program, which is an agency that we at Chumray have worked with for years and years, dealing with homelessness in our own community. And so when we talk about giving, Mark, you've just given me the lead in to say, and I really appreciate that. And look what happened, look for the December notice. And Mark, I can't tell you enough. This has been a very moving and wonderful moment. Dale, Sam, thank you for bringing that.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me. It's really a treat.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark.
Good night.
Good night.